So, are we actually seeing a society pulling itself apart at the seams? Or is this really a battle over who gets to tell the story? Today, we're digging into a source that claims a recent TV special in Australia isn't just about division. It's actually a symptom of a much, much bigger power struggle.
And this quote right here, it really sums up the entire argument of our source material. It basically frames everything we're about to explore. This idea that what's being sold as a social schism is actually a panicked reaction from an establishment that feels its control slipping.
So, first up, we've got what you could call a tale of two schisms. We're going to look at the official goal of the TV show that sparked this whole thing, and then we'll stack it up against the source's very different take on what was really going on. Okay, so you can see the two sides laid out pretty clearly here. On one hand, you have the SBS program, Social Schism. It presented itself as this thoughtful exploration, trying to understand these growing political divides. But our source material, it says no way. It argues this was a defensive move from a media class that feels its influence is fading as more and more people start questioning the narratives they've been given. Now, this idea of being on the defensive, well, according to the source, it even showed up in who got an invitation to the show. The analysis we're looking at really questions whether this was a genuine conversation or, as the source puts it, a very carefully built echo chamber. And here's how the source breaks it all down. It claims the panel was just stacked with what it calls leftist establishment voices. A Teal MP, various commissioners, and so on. But at the same time, perspectives that the source would call Christian or socially conservative were, well, nowhere to be found. It argues this created a huge imbalance right from the get-go. And this is where the source points out what it sees as a huge irony. In its view, by hand-picking a pretty one-sided panel to sit around and talk about division, the show itself actually became a perfect example of the very problem it was supposed to be looking into. Okay, so moving on, let's look at the diagnosis. The source really highlights this fundamental clash over what's even causing all this friction in the first place. On the TV special, the blame was pointed squarely at one thing: social media. You had the Race Discrimination Commissioner calling it a highway of hate, saying it's a place where racism is profitable, it goes unchallenged, and then it eventually spills out onto the streets. But our source material comes back with a totally different take. It argues that a phrase like highway of hate is just, well, it's code. Code for a desire to shut down what it considers perfectly legitimate conservative criticism and political speech online. And to back this up, the source brings out the numbers. It shows the 74,000 people who tuned into the TV special and contrasts that with the millions being reached by independent media voices. So from this point of view, it's not really about hate speech. It's about the establishment losing its grip on the audience to this whole new media landscape. Which, of course, brings us to the solutions. And this is where the source really dissects the ideas that were floated on this show, and it has a pretty serious critique of every single one. The first solution that was offered up on the panel was, you guessed it, a call for more dialogue. People need to reach across the aisle, have those tough conversations with family and friends who see the world differently. But here's where the source cries foul, pointing to what it calls some major contradictions. It claims the very speaker calling for this dialogue refuses to publicly debate conservatives, runs a media platform that only features one side of the story, and even talked about her own family's voting habits on TV in a way the source found pretty patronizing. So the second proposed solution kind of moves beyond just talking and gets into actual regulation, specifically aimed at social media companies. A Teal MP, Allegra Spender, brought up this idea of a social media duty of care, and the source immediately flags this, saying, hang on a second. It argues that a law like that would never be applied evenly. It claims it would just end up being used to police and take down conservative content, basically becoming a one-sided censorship tool. And that brings us to the final proposed solution, rolling out a big national framework to combat racism. Now, to really get why the source is so critical here, we have to understand how it defines anti-racism. It's not just about, being against racism. It's presented as a very specific ideology where any statistical difference between groups is automatically blamed on systemic racism, period. No other explanations are even considered. And all of this leads to the source's grand conclusion, which reframes this whole thing as, really, a battle for the narrative of the entire country. And here's the bottom line for the source. The real division, it claims,
isn't left versus right among everyday people. No, it's a deep split between this unified media and political class and a general public that is just increasingly tuning them out.
This quote really cuts right to the heart of the source's whole argument. It suggests that the entire social schism program wasn't some honest investigation. It was more like a strategy meeting for how an establishment can deal with and neutralize a political threat to its power. And this leads to a pretty interesting reframing of a common political label. The source basically says that the term far right is being thrown around all wrong. It argues that the people getting hit with this label aren't extremists at all. They're just mainstream, common sense conservatives who are finally getting good at pushing back against the establishment story. And that really leaves us with one big question to think about. In a media world this polarized, the power to frame the problem often dictates the solution. So the real question isn't just what the schism is, but who gets to define it in the first place.